her face bent into the single wrinkle of the small white neck. You dream, you absolute little dream. Yes, admitted the child calmly. Daisy turned her around so that she faced Gatsby. Do you think they're pretty? She doesn't look like her father, explained Daisy. She looks like me. She's got my hair and shape of the face. Daisy sat back upon the couch. The nurse took a step forward and held out her hand. Come, Pammy. Goodbye, sweetheart. With a reluctant backward glance, the well-disciplined child held to her nurse's hand and was pulled out the door. Just as Tom came back, proceeding for gin Ricky-S that clicked full of ice, Gatsby took up his drink. They certainly look cool, he said, with visible tension. We drank in long, greedy swallows. I read somewhere that the sun's getting hotter every year, said Tom Johnny. It seems that pretty soon the Earth's going to fall into the sun minus, or wait a minute, minus. It's just the opposite minus. The sun's getting colder every year. Come outside, he suggested to Gatsby. I'd like you to have a look at the place. I went with them out to the veranda. On the green sound. Stagnant in the heat, one small sail crawled slowly toward the fresher sea. Gatsby's eyes followed it momentarily. He raised his hand and pointed across the bay. I'm right across from you. So you are. Our eyes lifted over the rose beds and the hot lawn and the weedy refuse of the dark days along shore. Slowly the white wings of the boat moved against the blue cool limit of the sky. Ahead lay the scalloped ocean and the abounding Blessed Isles. There's sport for you, said Tom, nodding. I'd like to be out there with him for about an hour. We had luncheon in the dining minus room, darkened, too, against the heat, and drank down nervous gaiety with the cold ale. What'll we do with ourselves this afternoon? Cried Daisy. And the day after that? In the next 30 years? Don't be morbid, Jordan said. Life starts all over again when it gets crisp in the fall. But it's so hot, insisted Daisy, on the verge of tears. And everything's so confused. Let's all go to town. Her voice struggled on through the heat, beating against it, molding its senselessness into forms. I've heard of making a garage out of a stable, Tom was saying to Gatsby. But I'm the first man who ever made a stable out of a garage. Gatsby's eyes floated toward her. She cried. You look so cool. Their eyes met, and they stared together at each other. Alone in space, with an effort, she glanced down at the table. You always look so cool, she repeated. She had told him that he loved him. And Tambia Kanan saw. He was astounded. His mouth opened a little, and he leaned back at Daisy as if he had just recognized her as someone he knew a long time ago. You resemble the advertisement of the man, she went on innocently. You know the advertisement of the man minus, all right? Broke in Tom quickly. I'm perfectly willing to go to town. Come on, minus, we're all going to town. He got up, his eyes still flushing between Gatsby and his wife. No one moved. Come on. His temper cracked a little. What's the matter anyhow? If we're going to town, let's start. His hand trembling with his effort at self-control, bore to his lips the last of his glass of ale. Daisy's voice got us to our feet and out onto the blazing gravel drive. Are we just going to go? She objected. Like this? Aren't we going to let anyone smoke a cigarette first? Everybody smoked all through lunch. Oh, that's a fun, she begged him. It's too hot to fuss. He didn't answer. Have it your own way, she said. Come on, Jordan. They went upstairs to get ready, while we three men stood there shuffling the hot pebbles with our feet. A silver curve of the moon hovered already in the western sky. Gatsby started to speak, changed his mind, but not before Tom wheeled and faced him expectantly. Have you got your stables here? Asked Gatsby with an effort. About a quarter of a mile down the road. Oh, I pause. I don't see the idea of going to town, broke out Tom savagely. Women get these notions in their heads minus. Shall we take anything to drink? Called Daisy from an upper window. I'll get some whiskey, answered Tom. He went inside. Gatsby turned to me rigidly. I can't say anything in his house, old sport. She's got a discreet voice, I remarked. It's full of minus. I hesitated. Her voice is full of money. He said suddenly. That was it. I'd never understood before. The jingle of it, the simple song of it. High in a white palace, the king's daughter. The golden girl. Tom came out of the house, wrapping a quart bottle in a towel, followed by Daisy and Jordan wearing small tight hats of metallic cloth and carrying light capes over their arms. Shall we all go in my car? Suggested Gatsby. He felt the hot, green leather of the seat. I ought to have left it in the shade. Is it standard shift? Demanded Tom. Yes. Well, you take my coupe and let me drive your car to town. The suggestion was distasteful to Gatsby. I don't think there's much gas. He objected. Plenty of gas, said Tom Booster-Solis. And it runs out, like in stock, like a drop at a drugstore. You can buy anything at a drugstore nowadays. I pause, followed this apparently pointless remark. Daisy looked at Tom frowning, and an indefinable expression. As if I had only heard it described in words, passed over Gatsby's face. Come on, Daisy, said Tom, pressing her with his hand toward Gatsby's car. I'll take you in this circus wagon. He opened the door, but she moved out from the circle of his arm. You take Nick and Jordan. We'll follow you in the coupe. She walked close to Gatsby, touching his coat with her hand. Jordan and Tom and I got into the front seat of Gatsby's car. Tom pushed the unfamiliar gears tentatively and was shut off into the oppressive heat, leaving them out of sight behind. Did you see that? Demanded Tom. See what? He looked at me keenly. Realizing that Jordan and I must have known all along. You think I'm pretty dumb, don't you? He suggested. Perhaps I am, but I have a minus, almost as second sight sometimes. That tells me what to do. Maybe you don't believe that. But science minus, he paused. The immediate contingency overtook him, pulled him back from the edge of the theoretical abyss. I've made a small investigation of this fellow, he continued. I could have gone deeper if I'd known minus. Do you mean you've been to a medium? Inquired Jord unhumorously. What? Confused, he stared at us as we laughed. My medium? About Gatsby? No, I haven't. I said, I've been making a small investigation of his past. And you found he was an Oxford man, said Jordan hopefully. Nurse. He wears a pink suit. Nevertheless, he's an Oxford man. Oxford, New Mexico, snorted Tom contemptuously. Or something like that. Listen, Tom. If you're such a snob, why did you invite him to lunch? Demanded Jordan crossly. Daisy invited him, she knew him. Before we were married, minus God knows where. We were all irritable now with the fading Elend. Aware of it, we drove for a while in silence. Then as Dr. T. J. Eckleberg's faded eyes came into sight down the road. I remembered Gatsby's caution about gasoline. "We've got enough to get us to town," said Tom. "But there's a garage right here," objected Jordan. "I don't want to get stalled in this baking heat." Tom threw on both brakes impatiently, and we slid to an abrupt, dusty stop under Wilson's sign. After a moment, the proprietor emerged from the interior of his establishment and gazed hollow-minded aside at the car. "Let's have some gas," cried Tom roughly. "What do you think we stopped for minus to admire the view?" "I'm sick," said Wilson without moving. "I've been sick all day." Tom demanded, "You sounded well enough on the phone." With an effort, Wilson left the shade and support of the doorway and, breathing hard, unscrewed the cap of the tank. In the sunlight, his face was green. "I didn't mean to interrupt your lunch," he said, "but I need money pretty bad, and I was wondering what you were going to do with your old car." "How do you like this one?" inquired Tom. "I bought weak." "It's a nice yellow one," said Wilson, as he strained at the handle. "Like to buy it? Big chance?" Wilson smiled faintly. "No, but I could make some money on the other." "What do you want money for?" "All of a sudden, I've been here too long. I want to get away. My wife and I want to go west." "Your wife does?" exclaimed Tom, startled. "She's been talking about it for 10 years. He rested for a moment against the pump, shading his eyes. "And now she's going, whether she wants to or not." Flashed by us with a flurry of dust and the flash of a waving hand. "What do I owe you?" demanded Tom harshly. "I just got wised up to something funny the last 2 days." He had discovered that Myrtle had some sort of life apart from him in another world, and the shock had made him physically sick. I stared at him and then at Tom, who had made a parallel discovery less than an hour before minus, and it occurred to me that there was no difference between men in intelligence or race so profound as the difference between the sick and the well. Wilson was so sick that he looked guilty, unforgivably guilty minus, as if he had just got some poor girl with child. "I'll let you have that car," said Tom. "I'll send it over tomorrow afternoon." And now I turned my head as though I had been warned of something behind. Over the ash heaps the giant eyes of Dr. T. J. Eckleberg kept their vigil, but I perceived after a moment, that other eyes were regarding us with peculiar intensity from less than 20 feet away. In one of the windows over the garage, the curtains had been moved aside a little, and Myrtle Wilson was peering down at the car. So engrossed was she that she had no consciousness of being observed, and one emotion after another crept into her face like objects into a slowly developing picture. Her expression was curiously familiar minus. It was an expression I had often seen on women's faces, but on Myrtle Wilson's face it seemed purposeless and inexplicable until I realized that her eyes, wide with jealous terror, were fixed not on Tom, but on Jordan Baker, whom she took to be his wife. There is no confusion like the confusion of a simple mind. And as we drove away, Tom was feeling the hot whips of panic. Those big movies around 50th Street are cool, suggested Jordan. I love New York on summer afternoons when everyone's away. There's something very sensuous about it, minus overripe, as if all sorts of funny fruits were going to fall into your hands. The word sensuous had the effect of further disquieting Tom, but before he could invent a protest, the coupe came to a stop and Daisy signaled us to draw up alongside. "Where are we going?" she cried. "How about the movies?" "It's so hot," she complained. "You go. We'll ride around and meet you after." "I'll be the man smoking the cigarettes. We can't argue about it here." "You follow me to the south side of Central Park, in front of the plaza." Several times he turned his head and looked back for their car. And if the traffic delayed, then he slowed up until they came into sight. I think he was afraid they would dart down a side street and out of his life forever. But they didn't. And we all took the less explicable step of engaging the parlor of a suite in the Plaza Hotel. The prolonged and tumultuous argument that ended by herding us into that room eludes me, though I have a sharp physical memory that, in the course of it, my underwear kept climbing like a damp snake around my legs and intermittent beads of sweat raced cool across my back. The notion originated with Daisy's suggestion that we hire 5 bathrooms and take cold baths. Each of us said over and over that it was a crazy idea minus. We all talked at once to a baffled clerk and thought, or pretended to think, that we were being very funny. The room was large and stifling, and though it was already 4 o'clock, opening the windows admitted only a gust of hot shrubbery from the park. Daisy went to the mirror and stood with her back to us, fixing her hair. "It's a swell suite," whispered Jordan respectfully, and everyone laughed. "Open another window," commanded Daisy without turning around. "There aren't any more," Well, we'd better telephone for an axe minus. The thing to do is to forget about the heat, said Tom impatiently. You make it 10 times worse by grabbing about it. He unrolled the bottle of whiskey from the towel and put it on the table. Why not let her alone, old sport? Remarked Gatsby. You're the one that wanted to come to town. There was a moment of silence. The telephone book slipped from its nail and splashed to the floor, whereupon Jordan whispered, "Excuse me, minus." But this time no one laughed. I'll pick it up, I offered. I've got it. Gatsby examined the parted string, muttered hum in an interested way, and tossed the book on a chair. That's a great expression of yours, isn't it? Said Tom sharply. What is? All this old sport business. Where'd you pick that up? Now see here, Tom, said Daisy, turning around from the mirror. Call up and order some ice for the mint julep. As Tom took up the receiver, the compressed heat exploded into sound, and we were listening to the portentous chords of Mendelssohn's Wedding March from the ballroom below. Imagine marrying anybody in this heat, cried Jordan dismally. Louisville in June. Somebody fainted? Who was it fainted? Tom? Biloxi, he answered shortly. I'm named Biloxi. He made boxes minus. That's a fact, minus. And he was from Biloxi, Tennessee. They carried him into my house, appended Jordan, because we lived just 2 doors from the church, and he stayed 3 weeks, until Daddy told him he had to get out. The day after he left, Daddy died. After a moment, she added, as if she might have sounded irreverent, there wasn't any connection. I used to know a Bill Biloxi from Memphis. He gave me an aluminum putter that I use today. The music had died down as the ceremony began, and now a long cheer floated in at the window, followed by intermittent cries of yai minus I minus EA, and finally by a burst of jazz as the dancing began. We're getting old, said Daisy. If we were young, we'd rise and dance. Remember Biloxi? Jordan warned her. Where'd you know him? Tom? Biloxi? He concentrated with an effort. I didn't know him. He was a friend of Daisy's. He was not. She denied. I'd never seen him before. He came down in the private car. Well, he said he knew you. He said he was raised in Louisville. Us a bird brought him around at the last minute and asked if we had room for him. Jordan smiled. He was probably bumming his way home. He told me he was president of your class at Yale. Tom and I looked at each other blankly. Below XI, first class. We didn't have any president minus Gatsby's for to beat a short. Restless tattoo, and Tom eyed him suddenly. By the way, Mr. Gatsby, I understand you're an Oxford man. Not exactly. Oh, yes. I understand you went to Oxford. Yes, minus, I went there. A pause. Then Tom's voice, incredulous and insulting. You must have gone there about the time Biloxi went to New Haven. Another pause. A waiter knocked and came in with crushed mint and ice, but the silence was unbroken by his thank you and the soft closing of the door. This tremendous detail was to be cleared up at last. I told you I went there, said Gatsby. I heard you. But I'd like to know. It was in 19 minus 19. I only stayed 5 months. That's why I can't really call myself an Oxford man. Tom glanced around to see if we mirrored his unbelief. But we were all looking at Gatsby. It was an opportunity they gave to some of the officers after the armistice. He continued. We could go to any of the universities in England or France. I wanted to get up and slap him on the back. I had one of those renewals of complete faith in him that I'd experienced before. Daisy rose, smiling faintly, and went to the table, opened the whiskey. Tom, she ordered, and I'll make you a mint julep. Then you won't seem so stupid to yourself. Look at the mint. Wait a minute, snapped Tom. I want to ask Mr. Gatsby one more question. Go on, Gatsby said politely. What kind of a row are you trying to cause in my house anyhow? They were out in the open at last and Gatsby was content. He isn't causing a row. Daisy looked desperately from one to the other. You're causing a row. Please have a little self-control. Self-control, repeated Tom incredulously. I suppose the latest thing is to sit back and let Mr. Nobody from nowhere make love to your wife. Well, if that's the idea, you can count me out. Nowadays people begin by sneering at family life and family institutions. And next they'll throw everything overboard and have intermarriage between black and white. Flushed with his impassioned gibberish, he saw himself standing alone on the last barrier of civilization. We're all white here, murmured Jordan. I know I'm not very popular. Angry as I was, as we all were, I was tempted to laugh whenever he opened his mouth. The transition from libertine to prig was so complete. I've got something to tell you, old sport. Minus, began Gatsby. But Daisy guessed at his intention. Please don't, she interrupted helplessly. Please, let's all go home. Why don't we all go home? That's a good idea. Nobody wants a drink. I want to know what Mr. Gatsby has to tell me. Your wife doesn't love you, said Gatsby. She's never loved you. She loves me. You must be crazy. Vivid with excitement. She never loved you. Do you hear? He cried. She only married you because I was poor and she was tired of waiting for me. At this point, Jordan and I tried to go, but Tom and Gatsby insisted with competitive firmness that we remain minus, though neither of them had anything to conceal, and it would be a privilege to partake vicariously of their emotions. Sit down, Daisy. Tom's voice groped unsuccessfully for the paternal note. What's been going on? I want to hear all about it. I told you what's been going on, said Gatsby. Going on for 5 years minus and you didn't know. Tom turned to Daisy sharply. You've been seeing this fellow for 5 years? Not seeing, said Gatsby. No, we couldn't meet, but both of us loved each other all that time. Old sport. And you didn't know. I used to laugh sometimes minus, but there was no laughter in his eyes. To think that you didn't know. Oh, minus, that's all. Tom tapped his thick fingers together like a clergyman and leaned back in his chair. You're crazy, he exploded. I can't speak about what happened 5 years ago. Because I didn't know Daisy then minus. And I'll be damned if I see how you got within a mile of her unless you brought the groceries to the back door. But all the rest of that's a goddamned lie. Daisy loved me when she married me, and she loves me now. No, said Gatsby, shaking his head. She does though. The trouble is that sometimes she gets foolish ideas in her head and doesn't know what she's doing. He nodded sagely. And what's more, I love Daisy too. Once in a while, I go off on a spree and make a fool of myself. But I always come back, and in my heart, I love her all the time. You're revolting, said Daisy. She turned to me, and her voice, dropping an octave lower, filled the room with thrilling scorn. Do you know why we left Chicago? I'm surprised that they didn't treat you to the story of that little spree. Gatsby walked over and stood beside her. Daisy, that's all over now. It doesn't matter anymore. Just tell him the truth minus, that you never loved him minus, and it's all wiped out forever. She looked at him blindly. Why? Minus, how could I love him minus, possibly? You never loved him. She hesitated. Her eyes fell on Jordan and me with a sort of appeal, as though she realized at last what she was doing minus, and as though she had never, all along, intended doing anything at all. But it was done now. It was too late. I never loved him, she said, with perceptible reluctance. Not at Kapiolani, demanded Tom suddenly. No, from the ballroom beneath. Muffled and suffocating chords were drifting up on hot waves of air. Not the day I carried you down from the punch bowl to keep your shoes dry? Please don't. Her voice was cold, but the rancor was gone from it. She looked at Gatsby. There, Jay, she said minus, but her hand, as she tried to light a cigarette, was trembling. Suddenly, she threw the cigarette and the burning match on the carpet. Oh, you want too much, she cried to Gatsby. I love you now, minus. Isn't this enough? I can't help what's past. She began to sob helplessly. I did love him once minus, but I loved you too. Gatsby's eyes opened and closed. You loved me, T.O.O., he repeated. Even that's a lie, said Tom savagely. She didn't know you were alive. Why, minus, there are things between Daisy and me that you'll never know. Things that neither of us can ever forget. The word seemed to bite physically into Gatsby. I want to speak to Daisy alone, he insisted. She's all excited now, minus. Even alone, I can't say I never loved Tom, she admitted in a pitiful voice. It wouldn't be true. Of course it wouldn't, agreed Tom. She turned to her husband. As if it mattered to you, she said. Of course it matters. I'm going to take better care of you from now on. You don't understand, said Gatsby with a touch of panic. You're not going to take care of her anymore. I'm not. Tom opened his eyes wide and laughed. He could afford to control himself now. Why's that? Daisy is leaving you. Nonsense. I am. Though, she said with a visible effort, she's not leaving me. Tom's words suddenly leaned down over Gatsby. Certainly not for a common swindler who'd have to steal the ring he put on her finger. I won't stand this, cried Daisy. Oh, please, let's get out. Who are you, anyhow? Broke out Tom. You're one of that bunch that hangs around with Meyer Wolf, sheer minus, that much I happen to know. I've made a little investigation into your affairs minus, and I'll carry it further tomorrow. You can suit yourself about that, old sport, said Gatsby steadily. I found out what your drugstores were. He turned to us and spoke rapidly. He and this wolf Shiam bought up a lot of side minus street drugstores he ran in Chicago and sold grain alcohol over the counter. That's one of his little stunts. I picked him for a bootlegger the first time I saw him, and I wasn't far wrong. What about it? Said Gatsby politely. I guess your friend Walter Chase wasn't too proud to come in on it. And you left him in the lurch, didn't you? You let him go to jail for a month over in New Jersey. God, you ought to hear Walter on the subject of YOU. He came to us dead broke. He was very glad to pick up some money. Old sport, don't you call me old sport, cried Tom. Gatsby said nothing. Walter could have you up on the betting laws too. But Wolf Shiam scared him into shutting his mouth. That unfamiliar yet recognizable look was back again in Gatsby's face. That drugstore business was just small change, continued Tom slowly. But you've got something on now that Walter's afraid to tell me about. I glanced at Daisy, who was staring terrified between Gatsby and her husband, and Jordan, who had begun to balance an invisible but absorbing object on the tip of her chin. Then I turned back to Gatsby minus and was startled at his expression. He looked minus, and this is said in all contempt for the babbled slander of his garden minus, as if he had killed a man. For a moment, the set of his face could be described in just that fantastic way. Defending his nay against accusations that had not been made. But with every word, she was drawing further and further into herself. So he gave that up, and only the dead dream fought on as the afternoon slipped away. Trying to touch what was no longer tangible, struggling unhappily, undespairingly, toward that lost voice across the room. The voice begged again to go. Please, Tom. I can't stand this anymore. Her frightened eyes told that whatever intentions, whatever courage she had had, were definitely gone. You to start on home. Daisy, said Tom, in Mr. Gatsby's car. She looked at Tom. Alarmed now, but he insisted, with magnanimous scorn. Go on. He won't annoy you. I think he realizes that his presumptuous little flirtation is over. They were gone, without a word, snapped out, made accidental. Isolated, like ghosts, even from our pity. After a moment, Tom got up and began rubbing the unopened bottle of whiskey in the towel. Want any of this stuff? Jordan, Nick? I didn't answer. Nick? He asked again. What? Want any? No, I just remembered that today is my birthday. I was 30. Before me stretched the portentous, menacing road of a new decade. It was 7 o'clock when we got into the coupe with him and started for Long Island. Tom talked incessantly, exulting and laughing, but his voice was as remote from Jordan and me as the foreign clamor on the sidewalk or the tumult of the elevated overhead. Human sympathy has its limits, and we were content to let all their tragic arguments fade with the city lights behind. 30 minus, the promise of a decade of loneliness. A thinning list of single men to know. A thinning brief minus case of enthusiasm. Thinning hair. But there was Jordan beside me who, unlike Daisy, was too wise ever to carry well minus forgotten dreams from age to age. As we passed over the dark bridge, her one face fell lazily against my coat shoulder, and the formidable stroke of 30 died away with the reassuring pressure of her hand. So we drove on toward death through the cooling twilight. He had slept through the heat until after 5, when he strolled over to the garage and found George, Wilson sick in his office minus really sick, pale as his own pale hair and shaking all over. Michaelis advised him to go to bed, but Wilson refused, saying that he'd miss a lot of business if he did. While his neighbor was trying to persuade him, a violent racket broke out overhead. "I've got my wife locked in up there," explained Wilson calmly. "She's going to stay there till the day after tomorrow, and then we're going to move away." Michaelis was astonished. They had been neighbors for 4 years, and Wilson had never seemed faintly capable of such a statement. Generally, he was one of these worn minus out men. When he wasn't working, he sat on a chair in the doorway and stared at the people and the cars that passed along the road. Colorless way. He was his wife's man, and not his own. So naturally, Michaelis tried to find out what had happened. But Wilson wouldn't say a word minus. Instead, he began to throw curious, suspicious glances at his visitor and ask him what he'd been doing at certain times on certain days. Just as the latter was getting uneasy, some workman came past the door, bound for his restaurant, and Michaelis took the opportunity to get away, intending to come back later. But he didn't. He supposed he forgot to. That's all. When he came outside again, a little after 7, he was reminded of the conversation because he heard Mrs. Wilson's voice, loud and scolding, downstairs in the garage. "Beat me," he heard her cry. "Throw me down and beat me. You dirty little coward." A moment later, she rushed out into the dusk, waving her hands and shouting. Before he could move from his door, the business was over. The death car, as the newspapers called it, didn't stop. It came out of the gathering darkness, wavered tragically for a moment, and then disappeared around the next bend. Michaelis wasn't even sure of its color minus. He told the first policeman that it was light green. The other car, the one going toward New York, came to rest 100 yards beyond, and its driver hurried back to where Myrtle Wilson, her life violently extinguished, knelt in the road and mingled her thick, dark blood with the dust. Mike Ellis and this man reached her first, but when they had torn open her shirtwads, still damp with perspiration, they saw that her left breast was swinging loose like a flappend. There was no need to listen for the heart beneath. The mouth was wide open and rich at the corners, as though she had choked a little in giving up the tremendous vitality she had stored so long. We saw the 3 or 4 automobiles and the crowd when we were still some distance away. "Wreck," said Tom. "That's good. Wilson I'll have a little business at last." He slowed down, but still without any intention of stopping until, as we came nearer, the hushed, intent faces of the people at the garage door made him automatically put on the brakes. "We'll take a look," he said doubtfully. "Just a look." I became aware now of a hollow, wailing sound which issued incessantly from the garage. Sound which, as we got out of the coupe and walked toward the door, resolved itself into the word cell. "My God," uttered over and over in a gasping moan. "There's some bad trouble here," said Tom excitedly. He reached up on tiptoes and peered over a circle of heads into the garage, which was lit only by a yellow light in a swinging wire basket overhead. Then he made a harsh sound in his throat and, with a violent thrusting movement of his powerful arms, pushed his way through. The circle closed up again with a running murmur of expectulable. It was a minute before I could see anything at all. Then new arrivals disarranged the line and Jordan, and I were pushed suddenly inside. Myrtle Wilson's body wrapped in a blanket, and then in another blanket, as though she suffered from a chill, in the hot night lay on a work table by the wall, and Tom, with his